here. It lies behind the sternum and directly above the diaphragm. Seen from the side, the heart is here, occupying almost all the space between the vertebral bodies behind and the sternum in front. When the diaphragm thorax itself, enclosed by the ribs and intercostal muscles. Then we'll remove this part of the rib cage on each side, revealing the lungs, which are fully inflated here. When we let the lungs deflate, we can see the heart behind the sternum, contained within its protective jacket of pericardium. To see it better, we'll take the lungs, the sternum, and the pericardium out of the picture. This is the heart. This is the diaphragm. The major blood vessels that lead into and out of the heart take up almost as much space as the heart itself. I tend to think the atria, the inlet chambers, are above, and the ventricles, the pumping chambers, are below. Here are the ventricles in front. Here are the atria behind. This generous coating of epicardial fat makes it hard to see the four chambers distinctly. To see them more clearly, we'll go to a heart in which almost all the fat has been removed. In this specimen, all four chambers have been distended with equal pressure, making the atria somewhat larger than normal. This is a directly posterior view of the heart. This is a directly anterior view. The massive thick-walled left ventricle projects forward and to the left. The thinner-walled right ventricle is partially wrapped around the left one. We'll see the ventricles by themselves in a minute. For now, let's go round to the back and look at the two atria. This is the left atrium. This is the right atrium. Blood coming from the upper part of the body enters the right atrium by way of the superior vena cava. Blood coming from the lower part of the body enters it by way of the much larger inferior vena cava. In a more intact dissection, here's the inferior vena cava coming up through the diaphragm and almost immediately entering the right atrium. In addition to the two venae cavae, blood from the heart itself enters the right atrium under here by way of the coronary sinus, which we'll see later. From the upper part of the right atrium, this blind pouch, the right auricle or atrial appendage, projects forwards. The thin wall of the right atrium is formed largely of muscle. When the atrium contracts in diastole, the blood in it passes forwards into the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve, which is here. The left atrium and the right atrium are in contact here, where they share a common wall, the interatrial septum, which lies quite obliquely. To look at the inside of the right atrium, we'll remove this part of its wall. Here's the opening of the superior vena cava above and of the inferior vena cava below. Here's the opening of the coronary sinus. Look at the left atrium. Blood coming from the lungs enters the left atrium by way of the four pulmonary veins, two from the right lung, two from the left. The left atrium, like the right one, has a blind pouch which projects upwards and forwards. In diastole, the blood that's in the left atrium passes forwards into the left ventricle through the left. Now we'll move on to look at the two ventricles and their inlet valves. To see them clearly, we'll look at a heart in which the right and left atrium have been removed, leaving just the two ventricles. Here's the right ventricle, seen from the right side. Here's the left ventricle, seen from the front. Going round to the back, this is the right ventricle, this is the left one. They're separated by the interventricular septum, which is here. We're looking forwards into the wide-open atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid on the right, the mitral on the left. On the right side, blood passes downwards and forwards to fill the right ventricle in diastole. Then, in systole, it passes upwards and to the left into the pulmonary trunk, passing through the pulmonary valve, which is here. On the left, blood also passes downwards and forwards to fill the ventricle, then gets turned completely around in systole, passing upwards and backwards into the aorta. It passes through the aortic valve, which is out of sight, here. This is part of the interventricular septum. The left ventricle is on the other side of it. Now let's take a look at the tricuspid valve and its appendages. The tricuspid valve is also called the right atrioventricular valve. It usually has 3 cusps, sometimes only 2. Here there are 3. They're known as the septal, anterior, and posterior cusps. The posterior cusp is partly out of sight. These strands of tendon-like material attached near the edges of the valve cusps are the chordae tendinei. They arise from papillary muscles, which project from the wall of the ventricle. The papillary muscles and chordae tendinei prevent the cusps of the valve from prolapsing back into the atrium during systole. Here's the tricuspid valve set in motion passively by an intermittent current of water. When pressure in the ventricle rises, the cusps of the valve close together along quite an irregular line. The mitral valve is here. The aortic valve is out of sight up here. This is the apex of the ventricle. This part of the ventricular wall forms the interventricular septum. Here's the left ventricle in cross-section. Here's the right ventricle. The interventricular septum is curved. The left ventricle has a much thicker wall than the right, and it's circular in cross-section, while the right ventricle is C-shaped. Here, we're looking backward into the mitral valve. The mitral valve, also called the left atrioventricular valve, has 2 cusps. They're called the anterior cusp and the posterior cusp, though in reality they're more upper and lower. Chordae tendinei from both cusps converge on 2 sets of papillary muscles. These on the posterolateral wall of the ventricle, and these on the anteromedial wall. Here are the same papillary muscles seen from the apex of the ventricle. Each group of papillary muscles sends chordae tendinei to each of the cusps of the mitral valve. Here's the mitral valve in motion, seen from the apex of the left ventricle. Here are the papillary muscles seen very close. Above the mitral valve, we're looking upward and backward along the outflow tract of the left ventricle toward the aortic valve. In this cutaway dissection, we can see the outflow tract of the left ventricle from the side. Here's the aortic valve. We've left intact part of the anterior cusp of the mitral valve, along with the chordae tendinei and papillary muscles. The anterior cusp of the mitral valve forms part of the wall of the outflow tract, so blood flows past it this way in diastole and this way in systole. Here's the anterior cusp of the mitral valve in motion, with the mitral valve opening below it and the outflow tract above it. Here are the 2 ventricles, dissected so that we can see the outflow valves. Here's the aortic valve. Here's the pulmonary valve. Each has 3 cusps. The pulmonary trunk in each vessel, the dilatation, consists of 3 bulges, or sinuses, whose position matches the position of the valve cusps. To get a better look at the cusps of the outflow valves, we'll remove these parts of the vessel walls. Each cusp of an outflow valve is shaped like 1/3 of a parachute. Here the cusps are hanging loose. Each cusp has a delicate free border which closes against those of its neighbors. Here's the pulmonary valve in motion. In diastole, back pressure closes the valve abruptly, the three cusps pressing against each other to meet exactly at a point. Here's the aortic valve. It works in just the same way. Here's the opening of the right coronary artery, which we'll see in a minute. The left one is out of sight, down here. Now that we've seen the outflow valves, we'll move on to look at the two major outflow vessels, the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Here's the right coronary artery. It arises from the right aortic side. The right coronary artery passes round to the underside of the heart. Here it is again. Its terminal branch is the right interventricular artery. Now, we'll look at the left coronary artery. Here it is. It arises behind the pulmonary trunk from the left aortic, this circumflex branch, and several branches to the left ventricle, the longest of which is the left interventricular artery, also called the left anterior descending artery. Take a further all-around look at an intact heart, with all the epicardial fat intact. We'll take a second look at all four chambers, in the order in which blood passes through them. Here's the right atrium, with the superior vena cava entering above, and the inferior vena cava below. Here's the right atrial appendage. Here's the location of the tricuspid valve. Here's the right ventricle. It's almost obscured by fat. Here's the infundibulum. The pulmonary valve is here. Here's the pulmonary trunk passing to the left of the aorta and dividing into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Here's the left atrium with two pulmonary veins entering on the right and two on the left. Here's the left atrial appendage. The mitral valve is here. Here's the left ventricle with the major vessels that leave and enter it divided. To see where those vessels go and also to see the pericardial sac around the heart, we'll look at a dissection in which the anterior chest wall has been removed from the first rib to the eighth rib. The diaphragm is here. On each side, the lungs are quite collapsed. If they were fully expanded, they'd be out to here. Here's the heart, hidden within its protective sac of pericardium. In the intact body, the front of the pericardial sac is attached to the back of the sternum by this strip of mediastinal fat, all of which we'll remove. All this is the pericardial sac. The only major vessels we can see at this point are the aorta, emerging from the pericardial sac here, and the superior vena cava entering it here. To see more, we'll remove this much of the pericardium. Heart well covered with epicardial fat. The ventricles are freely mobile within the pericardial sac. Below, the pericardium is reflected onto the upper surface of the diaphragm, to which it's densely adherent. To right and left, the pericardium lies back to back with the parietal pleura. Here's the root of the aorta and of the pulmonary trunk. Here's the superior vena cava entering the right atrium from above. Each of the great vessels passes through an adherent cuff of pericardium as it enters or leaves the pericardial sac. Here's the inferior vena cava coming up through the diaphragm. Here are the left pulmonary veins and the left pulmonary artery passing through the pericardium separately. On the right, the pulmonary vessels are harder to see because they lead through a continuous cuff of pericardium that they share with the inferior vena cava. Here are the pulmonary veins. The artery is out of sight, up here of the heart. Here's the right atrium, the atrial appendage, the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava. Here's the interatrial septum, the fossa ovale, the opening for the coronary sinus, and the tricuspid valve. Here's the right ventricle. Here are the papillary muscles, and the chordae tendineae, and the infundibulum. Here's the pulmonary valve, and the pulmonary trunk, branching into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Here's the left atrium. Here are the pulmonary veins, right and left. Here's the interatrial septum again, and the mitral valve. Here's the left ventricle, the interventricular septum, the left ventricular outflow pathway, the aortic valve, and the aorta. Here's the left coronary artery. Here's the right one. Here's the coronary sinus. Here are the pericardium and pericardial sac.